Matthew chapter 24 for today's thoughts. Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, we'll read verses 1 through 5. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 5. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." The phrase was first spoken in 1956 in Louisiana at a Louisianan music festival. There were a number of musical acts during that time, and the one in the middle was a young man that was taking the country by storm. And he finished his performance, and there were more singers to come, and he left. And there was such a ruckus in the crowd of folks getting up out of their seats trying to see where he had gone that Horace Lee Logan came to the podium and said this, and I'll read it to you in its entirety. He said, all right, Elvis has left the building. I've told you absolutely straight up to this point. You know that he has left the building. He left the stage and went out the back with the policeman, and he is now gone from the building. Young people, if you don't know who Elvis is, ask your parents this afternoon. I thought of that phrase that we have adopted in our culture, and when something's over and finished, I've worked 30 years at this job. I'm leaving today. Elvis has left the building. It means it's done. There's no more to go. I thought of that last week when I began reading chapter 24, that Jesus had left the temple. But he had left the temple in a different way than Elvis had. The crowds weren't flocking to see where he had gone and wanting him back. In fact, very few had watched him go, mainly just his disciples. But in his walking away from the temple, he was making an absolute statement. He was not turning his back on the people of Israel, but on the nation itself and the religious leaders that had finally rejected him to a point where he was able to say that their house was now desolate. And they would not, as a nation, see him again until they cried out, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord." And they will someday in his second coming. But Jesus left the temple, and we pick that up in verse 1. So look at it with me. And he was going away. He was departing. And please don't miss the imagery of that. The significant moment that he was gone, turning his back, walking away. Notice his disciples have something to ask or point out. When his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Now, the disciples had seen these buildings of the Temple Mount, many times. Jesus had walked by these temple walls and mounts, and yet this was the first time recorded that they ever shrugged him on the corner and said, "Take a look." In other words, aren't you impressed? Look at the beautiful stones. William Barclay records a little vision of the temple itself. I'll read it to you so you get an idea of what they were pointing out, because it was beautiful and significant. In fact, it was one of the wonders of the first century. Many pilgrims came just to see this temple and the grounds around it. The summit of Mount Zion had been dug away to leave a plateau high 1,000 feet above the valley. At the far end of it was the temple itself, which was built of white marble platted with gold. And it shone in the sun so that a man could scarcely bear look at it while the sun shone in his face. Between the lower city and the Temple Mount lay the valley of Toroapin, and across this valley stretched a colossal bridge. The arc of the bridge spanned 41 feet, and its spring stones were 24 feet high and 6 inches thick. The temple area was surrounded by great porches: Solomon's porch, the Roman porch, the royal porch, These porches were upheld by pillars, each cut out of solid blocks of marble in one piece. They were 37.5 feet high and of such a thickness that 3 men linked around them could not reach the other side. The corners of the temple, there were angle stones that have been found to measure 20 and 30 feet in length, weighing more than 100 tons. How they were ever cut and placed in position is one of the mysteries of the ancient engineering. And here these Galilean fishermen, overwhelmed and impressed by this magnificent temple and grounds, wanted to point it out to Jesus. But why? You need to know that the disciples, the apostles, the 12 that surrounded him, had been out of sorts for weeks now. They had distanced themselves from the Savior both physically and emotionally. It all began weeks before in Caesarea Philippi when he began to talk about his death, his burial, and his resurrection. Remember, Peter confronted him and said, "Be it far from you." And you remember Jesus' response to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan." I'm telling you, that moment changed everything in the minds of the apostles up to this point. They didn't know him anymore. You ever said that to someone? I don't even know you anymore. Such an altering in his message, such an altering in his mission, and he set his sights toward Jerusalem and toward the cross, and they followed him, but they followed him reluctantly. They had watched him teach in the temple. They had watched him confront the religious leaders, and of all the men that they wanted him to impress, he had condemned them. Up to the point where he was condemning the entire nation of Israel when he says, behold, your house is left to you desolate. It is empty now. I'm done with this. With a shred of hope within them. They did not want him to go in this direction. They did not want him to abandon the temple and Jerusalem and the nation. They wanted him to come in and rescue all that mess. But there's one thing that God will never rescue is a religion. He'll never rescue men's efforts to get to God. He condemns all of religion. And so, almost in desperation, and we're not told which apostle grabbed his shoulder, maybe they're all starting to talk about it, they slow him down and say, wait a minute, don't give up. Look at what's going on. The very thing he said, with everything they were looking at, was completely insane. This temple had been built by by Herod. Solomon's first temple had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. This temple had been built by Herod the Great. It was 40 years in making, and it was more magnificent than the first temple by a tremendous amount. The white marble, the gold, the spectacular look of this thing. Not only that, they were in the midst of a Passover, and there were 1 million Jews crowding into Jerusalem. It was Disneyland plus 10. Got it? Elbow to elbow. You could barely. This was popular, man. There were crowds and crowds of people with a magnificent. The Romans were leaving the Jews alone. The Romans' policy is, look, you don't mess with Rome, we won't mess with you. You have whatever religion. The religion was going well. Crowds were coming. Buildings were beautiful. But God condemned it because his spirit and his presence wasn't there, and the religious leaders had oppressed their followers, God's followers. So, Lord, aren't you impressed in what we've done here? Can I give you a little hint? God's never impressed with what man can do. He's really not. He's really not. You know, all of Jesus' illustrations are all out of nature. There's nothing that man has ever made that Jesus used for an illustration when he taught. He talked about the lilies of the field. He talked about things of nature, not man. You think today he'd be so impressed with our internet and the speed of everything and how we can communicate. Oh, he'd be so impressed with automobiles riding down. He'd be so impressed with air. He wouldn't be impressed with any of that. He'd still be talking about the lilies of the field, because that's where the glory is and what God does. So in trying to impress them, Jesus doesn't turn to them and say, yeah, it's pretty good. Maybe I can do something with this. He puts his foot on the gas pedal and says to them in verse 2, see all these things, do you not? Impressive. You think you're real impressed with this stuff? Then take a look at it. Yeah, I see it. You see it. I see it. You see it. I see it. Isn't it beautiful? I mean, it's great, isn't it? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. It happened in 70 A.D. It happened in 70 A.D. And we're going to go into the siege of Jerusalem in coming weeks and talk about how horrid that was. And it was a terrible siege. 5 months in length, the Romans went after the city of Jerusalem. But I'll just cut to the chase. In the end, the Romans broke down the walls. 5 months they've been waiting. 5 months they've been waiting to get into that city. They were tired. They were angry. They were resentful to the Jews for resisting them this long. And the Roman general Titus turned his back to the soldiers as sometimes commanders will do, and say, have at it, do what you want. And he walked away. And those Roman soldiers did what they wanted in Jerusalem. Every building was torn down. The people were ravished, murdered, innocent children killed. But there was a rumor sweeping around the soldiers. It was a rumor that the Jews had taken all their gold, which they were famous for, and had hid them in the walls of the temple, in the walls of the city. They had hid them everywhere. Well, if I'm a Roman soldier, I want some of that gold. They broke down every wall of every temple all over the place looking for that gold. There was not one stone left upon another when they got done. Now, I say this to you for this reason. We are preparing to launch on the longest teaching of prophecy that Jesus ever gave. We'll outline it before we leave today. Much of this prophecy has been fulfilled, some has not. But know that the very first prophecy that Jesus gives in this longest, it's called the Olivet Discourse, done on the Mount of Olives. And the very first thing he says was fully fulfilled within almost a lifetime of when he spoke it, to the letter. Well, if you perhaps don't think that they were rattled to this point, he had just let the air out of the rest of the balloon. Squealing was done. There laid the flat balloon on the floor, and they had nothing left in them. But followed on they did, and notice in verse 3, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him. I want you to look at that first phrase of verse 3, and I want you to meditate with me on it. And I want you to put your mind in the moment. Jesus walks up on the Mount of Olives. Luke tells us that it's opposite the temple. So he walks up this mount, and where does he sit? He sits on a rock. He sits on the ground. He sits down. And he looks at the temple. Now think about the moment that we're seeing here in the Son of God, in the King of the Jews. He knew all things. He felt all things. There was nothing that could possibly have happened that wasn't in the scope of his knowledge. This is the closest on earth you see of the King of the Jews sitting on his throne, and it was on the Olivet Mount on a rock looking over the city that was his. What did he see? First of all, he saw a crowd of Jews trying to get to God with the religious leaders oppressing them. He saw those who he wanted to take under his wings as a hen takes under her chicks and protect, and they would not come to him. He saw religious leaders who should have bowed down to him, rejecting him to the point where they were plotting his death. As he's watching Jerusalem, they're running around plotting his death, and they think, we're doing this in secret. He doesn't know. He's watching them do it. Betrayed by religious leaders, stiff-armed by his own people. Before crowds flocked to him on the great Palm Sunday. That was a week ago now, almost a week, and now no one would have anything to do with him. The disciples who had followed him on that mount, there was only 4 of them. Interesting, Mark tells us the only 4 who came to him sitting there was Peter, James, John, and Andrew. We threw Andrew in the mix of the 3 now. I find it fascinating that a prophecy about this planet and this earth and what God's doing in this world is given to 4 apostles, 4 being the number of the earth. And as where were the other 8? Well, where were the other 7? You know where the one was. Only 4 came to even ask him about this stuff. Any one of those things would have crushed a normal man. And here you have the Son of God, God in the flesh, not only bearing under the rejection of a nation, the scourge and judgment and rejection of the religious leaders, disciples who did not understand him, the people who would not follow him. And he knew that after he got arrested, what happened to all of them? Gone. And yet he carried that weight with majesty and glory, knowing where he was heading, knowing that he was going to die for you and I, rose from the dead, and he knew what his kingdom would be, but right now his kingdom was a mess and looked disastrous. Worse than that. Who wouldn't give up at that point? But not Jesus Christ, not the King of glory sitting on his throne. When you think it's all lost, God always shows up. And he bears the weight of what's going on. Watch this. This is amazing. And to the answer that, let's see what question they have. Tell us, verse 3, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end or the consummation of the age? Now you've got to understand their question from a Jewish mindset and an apostle mindset of the first century. They were not asking, hey, what's the next 2,000 years going to bring us? They had no idea that 2,000 years were coming. They didn't see the church age. They didn't understand what was happening to the Jews and how they'd be dispersed. We look back at it. When they looked forward, the reason they were quiet when Jesus said, I'm going to die, was because they wanted him to be the Messiah right now in this life. And right now, how many times did they say to him, how many times did they ask him, will you now establish the kingdom and put us in place? They were asking him in a mindset. Now, his answer to their question went far beyond the present. But in their question, all they were asking was, when will these things be? In a day, in a week, in a month? Are you going to leave Jerusalem, let it kind of fall apart, and then 6 months later we'll all come back in? They had no idea what they were asking. Important to know that. When you see the phrase at the end of verse 3 of the end of the age, really consummation's a better term. The Jews in their mind had, the Greek word is ilion, eons. It is a space of time. In the Jews' mind, there was this time, and then it stops, and then there's another time. There's no end to the age. You know there's no end to this thing, right? You do know there's no end to you, right? Now we're all getting older, we're all breaking down, and we're all hurting in places we never hurt before. Our eyes are going and everything is going. That's not the end. In fact, that's indication that the next beginning is coming. It's exciting. So this end of the age, this consummation is when is things like we know it now are going to end and things brand new are going to begin. Have we seen our culture and world change in the last year? It makes our heads spin. We can't believe it. What's happening now is nothing compared to the kingdom that's coming and the change that's coming on this earth. It's just the beginning. Notice verse 4. Oh, let's do that. Let's do the outline for you. Jordan, go ahead and put the outline up there. This is the basic outline of the Olivet Discourse. And if you'll notice, it goes all the way to chapter 25, verse 46. And again, this is the longest answer to a question Jesus ever gave. Those who love prophecy, this is home turf, man. This is their candy stick. They love this. In a couple weeks, we anticipate Larry and Linda Unger rejoining us. When they get back from Montana, we'll all be happy to see them as we're happy to see everyone who returns. And so I know Larry's pawing at the ground for the Olivet Discourse, but you'll love it too when we get done, hopefully. Chapter 24, verse 5 through 35 is about the nation of Israel and God's dealings with the nation of Israel. Beginning in verse 36 of chapter 24, down to chapter 25, verse 30 is all about the church age, how God deals with the church. And the last segment in chapter 25, 31 through 46, is his judgment on the Gentile nations. Now, watch this. Don't miss this. It's important to remember that this is not chronological in nature. This is not dealing with, okay, he deals with Israel, and then, after 70 AD, now he's dealing with the church, and once the church gets raptured out, now he'll judge the nations. That's not the program there. All of these three segments happen spontaneously and in correspondence with each other throughout the last 2,000 years. God has been judging Gentile nations from the very beginning of this. He has been dealing with the church age since the day of Pentecost all through this time, and he has been dealing with the nation of Israel throughout this time. He's dealing with them now. So that is a threefold for those of you who like outlines and kind of want to know where we're going. That is it. All right, let's deal with the last few verses and then we'll call it a Sunday. Verse 4, and Jesus answered them, notice with a warning, see that no one leads you astray. See that no person leads you down a path that's away from me. It says, verse 5, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. Now, let's finish that verse. It says, for they will lead, notice, many astray. The first warning to this prophecy is all through all of these ages, there will be those who claim to be me. Now watch this very carefully because you need to understand what Jesus is saying here. Once in a while there's guys who hold up signs in parks that says, I am Jesus Christ. And when we pass by them, we know they're nuts, they're crazy, there's something wrong with them, right? How many have you ever seen multitudes following those guys with signs? Nobody follows that. Nobody follows that. He cannot mean those who literally say, I am Jesus Christ. Because whatever he means, and I'm going to share what I think he means here, whatever he means, there have been multitudes and multitudes have gone astray by this method, who have been led away from Christ, not toward him. I think it means this. It is very important for religious leaders, preachers, teachers, all involved in ministry, to faithfully point away from themselves to Jesus Christ. Not to enamor people with their charisma, not to wow them with their pithy statements, not to draw disciples to their form of teaching and doctrine, not to write books to engage people so that they just can't follow Jesus without you. These are false shepherds. When you hear a man teach, when you read his books, listen for Jesus Christ. If he's talking about himself, if he's cornered some little market of unique teaching that he just loves, if he uses human psychology that makes so much sense to everybody, but you leave thinking, that's so smart, I'm going to apply that to my life, by Tuesday it's all fizzled out because it's not about Jesus Christ. And there are many who fill pulpits and are filmed with TV cameras and write books to draw people to themselves. It happens all the time, and it is oppressive. It is the worst kind of oppression, spiritual oppression. John Adams was dying. He only had a few days to live. It was going to be the 4th of July, and he wanted to make it to the 4th of July. In fact, it was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He was up in Quincy. They wanted him to come down to Boston to the big celebration, but he was a couple days away from his death. He couldn't make it. And so those in Boston sent a delegation up to Quincy to ask him to give them a statement that they can read at this 50th celebration. So they went up to his study, and there he was in his chair, and they asked him, and he looked at them, and he said, "Independence forever." They asked, "Would you like to add something to that?" "No more," he said. "Freedom, independence, liberty forever. What's true of a country which we're fast losing that, what's true of a country that is free must be true of the spiritual life that is free, where there's liberty and independence and a marriage to Jesus Christ, where our hearts are being set free." We sing in this place with great enthusiasm, not because we've got this, but because we have Him there. It's a testimony of Christ within. And any faithful shepherd of the flock, any under shepherd of Christ, will always point away from himself, never taking himself serious, and espouse you to Jesus Christ. His death, His burial, His resurrected. The life He'll teach you, she'll teach you, the life that's in you, whatever teacher or preacher there is. Point to that, not him. Richard Rumbold, the 17th century soldier of Oliver Cromwell, was up on the scaffolds. And as they were tying the noose around his neck to hang him, he said in part this: "I am sure that there was no man born marked by God above another." Let me read that again. He said, "I am sure that there was no man born marked by God to be above another. For none comes into this world with a saddle on his back, neither any booted and spurred to ride him. We are all equal before God and equally free before God, and religious oppression and suppression over us is the worst." I lived in it for a lot of years as a believer, oppressed by spiritual leaders, oppressed by those who told me 1,000 things to do and frustrating me. Jesus said, "Beware, any who say to draw attention away from me onto themselves, because multitudes go astray." Give you a couple things. First of all, His presence is not found in the works of men's hands. His presence is not found in religion, in this Judaism that Jesus had turned His back on, or any religion. His presence is not found in the works of men's hands, but in the everyday miracle of life inside of us. Number two, His place of preeminence must be given to no man. He is preeminent. We are all equal before Him. And we bow down to a King of glory who sat on the side of that Mount of Olives and rolled out and laid out the program for the future. God's not against prophecy, and He's not against you knowing what's coming. Okay? I'm not an expert at prophecy. I really am. It's not my thing. I love it. It's not my thing. I want to know enough of prophecy so that when it's all happening, I kind of look around and go, okay, I knew that was coming. I saw that. Oh, I saw that. That's exactly what he meant by that right over there. Look at that. I want to see it. And we're seeing it now. In fact, we're the only people in all the world who have their eyes open. We're the only people in all the world that are excited about what's going on. Everybody else is wringing their hands. We're raising our hands. Are we not? I went fishing with Lorelei last Friday. The river was too muddy. We didn't catch anything, but she pulled in a blue crab. And it was heavy, and she was getting it in. Now, blue crabs are hard to catch because a blue crab will catch that. They're smart. They'll catch that hook, and then they'll pull it to their mouth, and they'll eat the shrimp, right? So when you pull in a blue crab, he's got that pincher on there. He's got that pincher on there on that hook eating. But when he sees you with the pole, he looks up and goes, oh, I don't want any part of that, and he just lets it go and drops off. But this blue crab had a little bit of the hook. He got a little aggressive with the shrimp. He had a little bit of it hooked in his mouth. And she got him. Now, I'll be honest with you, if Steve got pinched with a little one, this one was bigger. I showed a picture to Steve. He said that thing could have close to breaking your finger. And I know that. And if you ever catch a blue crab and you got them on a dock, I mean, they're agile. They're smart. I mean, they move like that. You move, they move. And so I picked the line up and dropped him, as the brave man I am, dropped him in the ice box and took a long fillet knife and worked that hook out. He got it in his mouth. If you ever get religion hooked in your jaw, it's hard to get out of it. It's hard to get out of it. When you see grace and you hear grace, let the hook go. Release it out of your pinchers. Okay? Because I'm telling you, religion will kill you. I'll close with it because I just got to tell you. We got that blue crab home and still moving around and put him on the driveway with the grandkids. And they had a time. I mean, he was moving around and they were screaming. And he was a little frozen, so he's a little slow. I think if we left him out there a little longer in the heat, he'd have heated up and got into his, but I wouldn't let him get to his full form because I had other plans for that crab. Anyway, Whitney boiled the water and boiled the water. And the little basket looked too small, right? I thought, we'll never get that crab in that little basket. But you know, I picked him up and put him in the basket, and he wasn't, but it was a few minutes that steam hit him, he just kind of curled up and fit right in there real nice. I share that because it'll upset some of you. Lord Jesus, we thank you for these verses. We thank you for this truth. Lord, the hook of religion, once speared in the mouth, is hard to get out. But thank God, by the grace of God, we can let go and enjoy the freedom and liberty that men would keep back from us. That men would hold us in their own bondage and oppression when you have died and given your life to set us free from sin and guilt and bondage and worry and in this world. Lord Jesus, we love you, praise you in Christ's name. Amen.